All right, so as Joe said, my name is Hannah Stitzline. I'm the Visiting Metadata Services Specialist for the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And hopefully you are here because you are either a contributing member to the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub or you are interested in being a contributor. Either way, thank you for coming, and we're going to jump right in. So this is going to be broken up into two parts. The first part is going to discuss how metadata functions in DPLA, how shareable metadata works as part of that. And then we'll get a little bit into how we map elements from Dublin Core to from your local fields, and then we'll talk a little bit again about the metadata enrichment. We'll give a little bit of time for some questions at that point if you have any questions. If not, we'll move on to the second part. The second part we'll talk specifically about the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub metadata best practices, and then why controlled vocabularies and mapping matter, as well as which elements get harvested by IDHH and then made available in DPLA. So we're going to talk a little bit about metadata in DPLA. So some of you, hopefully most of you, are familiar with what DPLA is, but if you're not, we're going to just go over what DPLA is. So the DPLA is the Digital Public Library of America, and it is a portal to digital resources contributed by cultural heritage institutions from across the United States. It is a portal in that the digital content, like an image or an audio file, is not really, it's not literally stored by DPLA. It's not in DPLA, but DPLA provides access to the digital content by aggregating metadata so that users can find what they need in one place. The metadata is harvested by DPLA from content and service hubs. So the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub is a service hub. And that means that we are pulling from a lot of different contributors. Generally speaking, content hubs are only pulling from one contributor. The digital resources that are available through DPLA include items in different formats such as photographs, documents, three-dimensional objects, video, and many other different formats. DPLA is used by many individuals, including researchers, educators, and students, but some people also use it for genealogy and various other research reasons. Currently, there are more than 16 million digital resources accessible through DPLA, and 204,000 of those are being contributed by the IDHH, which is actually a pretty significant number for DPLA. So what does your metadata look like in DPLA? So this is a snapshot of what the metadata for a digital resource looks like in DPLA, in the DPLA portal, and that's on the left-hand side. And then in the native environment on the right-hand side. You'll notice that not all the metadata fields that are in the native environment are seen in DPLA. Similarly, some of the metadata fields are labeled differently in DPLA. So DPLA has a set list of labels for the metadata fields, which are not based on contributing institutions' local fields. And this is why shareable metadata is so very important. Having shareable metadata ensures that the information about the resource is understandable regardless of which environment that the item is being accessed in. So that brings to the question, how does the metadata get from the contributing institution from that native environment to DPLA? This diagram shows how IDHH contributes metadata to DPLA. So on the top left, you see the many digital collections that are being contributed to IDHH. When this metadata is harvested, it is available for harvest via an OAI PMH feed, and then that goes into a REPOC server. Once in the REPOC server, then we review and enhance the metadata to ensure that it is shareable. During this process, we'll communicate with you and the contributing institutions when remediation is necessary, and I will go into when remediation is necessary later. And then when that is ready, the metadata is then harvested and ingested by DPLA and becomes available in the DPLA portal. So shareable metadata is optimized for interoperability across multiple platforms. When metadata is shareable, the content can be understood by users no matter where it is accessed. Shareable metadata doesn't have a single defining characteristic, but rather several characteristics. Sarah Shreves, Jen Riley, and Liz Mielewitz wrote a fantastic article called Moving Towards Shareable Metadata, and they basically outline what shareable metadata is, and they call it the 6 C's and lots of S's. So I'm going to just go through those 6 C's and lots of S's, and that we'll kind of track back to those throughout the presentation. So the first is content. This includes both the metadata and the digital object. They say that the record should describe the resource with the granularity appropriate for the materials and their intended use. Second, we have consistency. So for example, standardized formatting, controlled vocabularies, or uniform fields in each record where possible. Creating or using a best practices document such as the IDHH Metadata Best Practices, or you might have one at your own home institution, which may include definitions, field names, controlled vocabularies, etc. Using that best practices document is encouraged for digital collections as it provides consistency amongst the metadata. Thirdly, we have coherence. So the biggest question is the metadata understandable to somebody that didn't create the collection or does not know about the collection or is not familiar with it in any way? Any metadata associated with the digital object should be easily understood by anyone. Technical metadata, such as the resolution of the digital image and the name of the scanner, may be useful for the collection owner, but generally speaking, it's not useful to just kind of your general user who's interested in the resource itself. If that type of metadata is included in a collection, the metadata field should not be displayed in the user interface or made available for service providers like DPLA. In the case of DPLA, it just means that you don't map it to a DC field, so we can't harvest it. Next, we have context. So users should be able to understand the general context of the digital object without having to do significant searching. Providing more context for a resource can be helpful to users so that they have all the information they need to understand what they're accessing. Additionally, users shouldn't have to go to Wikipedia in order to understand your resource. So that's something to really think about while you're creating metadata. So let's see, number 5 here. The metadata provider communicates with aggregators through direct or indirect means. So for instance, the best example is communicating when a collection is ready for harvesting. Conversely, we will communicate with you if there's anything that needs to be changed in order for it to be able to go to DPLA. And then lastly, we have conforms to standards, such as conformance to technical standards or descriptive content standards. So again, we're going to kind of go back and forth between the actual practical application and how that relates back to shareable metadata. So then the question is, why does shareable metadata matter? In DPLA, shareable metadata makes a difference for several reasons. First, it ensures your digital resources are best represented in the DPLA environment. It means that they're more discoverable. When metadata is shareable, the metadata links with other resources, and when conforming to standards such as controlled vocabularies, materials will link with other resources that share the same terms. So linked terms can be found in partner, contributor, subject, location, and type. And those are all the DPLA label terms or the labels on those terms that link together. It also provides a better user experience. So users get the most relevant materials when they perform a search in DPLA or even at your local institution because those materials are discoverable. Users will have confidence that they are finding appropriate materials when they are presented with sufficient and quality information. And what I mean by quality here is that the spelling is all correct and the there's no weird spacing or commas. So just making sure that your information looks like valid information. Users are also more likely to visit the original digital collection if the terms are consistent and it looks like trustworthy information. So what is mapping and why does it matter in DPLA? Shareable metadata can be achieved by careful mapping, and mapping enables interoperability between metadata schema. So here we have a lovely little diagram again. IDHH harvests metadata in qualified Dublin core as an OAI PMH feed. This is mapped from contributing institutions' local metadata fields. And then the harvested metadata is then mapped to the DPLA metadata application profile. Once it is mapped to the DPLA metadata application profile, it is visible in the DPLA portal. So to give you an example of why mapping matters, I'm going to go through just the an example of items that are mapped to description. So in the first table you see that the tables have different local labels. You have audio exists and description. In this table it's clear that yes, that the yes value belongs to audio exists. But when audio exists is mapped to DPLA, or sorry, is mapped to DC description and DPLA harvests that, the meaning of yes is lost because the meaning, or sorry, because yes no longer has the local label of audio exists to give it a context. Additionally, all fields mapped to a single QDC or qualified Dublin core field will be seen as a single field in DPLA. So you'll see in the bottom half that yes and color video of field day at the University of Lautrec in spring semester of 1965 are all in the same DPLA field. So what do you do with that? In this particular case, the field audio exists should either be not mapped to a DC field, which means that IDHH will not harvest it, or if you want it to be harvested, it is ideal to provide context to the information in that field. So kind of go over what that looks like. So for one, you provide context. So here, you give the context of audio exists in the metadata itself, and it's not reliant upon that local field. So when it goes into DPLA, it's clear that yes, audio exists has a full meaning unto itself, even though it's combined and it doesn't have that local field name anymore. So that's one option that you have here. The second option is to not map it to a Dublin core field. This allows the information that can stand alone without local field names to be harvested by IDHH. And then you'll see in the second table that yes is not included in the DPLA description field, so it gets removed out of there. To that end, this will not affect what happens at the local level. It only affects what is visible on the DPLA side. So you see that there. All right. So we have a table here that represents the crosswalk between qualified Dublin core, simplified Dublin core, mods, and the DPLA metadata application profile. And then on the left-hand side, we see the DPLA label. All of the fields that are in bold are field names that are visible in the DPLA portal. And then in the next half of the presentation, we'll go into more depth on how each of those fields functions and the best way to map those. So what metadata does DPLA enrich? So that's something that's really going to affect how your metadata is seen in DPLA. So DPLA enriches two metadata fields to provide a better discovery and browsing service. The first is geographic metadata in DC term spatial, which is enriched by DPLA for use in the explore by place search function. And then the second is the creation date or date of creation, and that is mapped to DC date, and that is enriched by DPLA for use in the explore by date or the timeline search function. Okay, so the geographic enrichment. After harvesting metadata from IDHH, DPLA enriches the geographic data by matching values with known geographic vocabularies, and that's typically coming from geonames. When hierarchical names, or hierarchical geographic terms rather, are used, all terms should be included in a single DC terms spatial field instead of using multiple. So you see that in that first example, it's all in one DC term spatial, as opposed to that bottom example, which is 3 individual fields. So when the geographic data is separated into multiple DC term spatial, each geographic term is processed as a separate geographic location, and the separated terms are human readable in that instance, and we're all able to infer that those are related, that that's Cairo, Illinois, so that's Cairo in Alexander County in Illinois, but because the enrichment process is done by a machine, it's not able to make that leap and understand that those terms are connected together. So that's why it's better to keep them all in a single field. And it's especially important for geographically ambiguous terms. So for example, there are many states with Hamilton, Washington, and Wayne counties. Similarly, there are many cities around the world named Lancaster, Peru, and Bloomington. In the United States alone, there are 13 states with Bloomington as a city name. So it's really important to consider how that is going to be matched by geonames. So just to give you an example, since we're in Illinois here, this map of Illinois illustrates the many towns with place names that occur as other cities, states, and countries. And in total, there are more than 55 towns named after other places in this state alone. So for instance, Cuba is going to more likely have a geoname match to Cuba, the country, as opposed to Cuba, Illinois, if that's not given context. So it'll actually put your the record itself as related to Cuba, the country, and it won't show up in the U.S. map that DPLA provides. So it's something to really consider when you're doing those. So again, why formatting matters. DPLA has enriched the geographic values with matching values from geonames. So again, we talked about this just a moment ago, but when Cairo is unspecified, it gets incorrectly matched to Cairo, Egypt. Alexander County gets mapped to Alexander County, North Carolina. And because Illinois is not geographically ambiguous, it actually gets matched correctly. And bad matches like the first two can be fixed by combining the geographic terms into a single field. And that way the machine readable enrichment is able to understand that better. So next we have date enrichment. DPLA enriches metadata in the DC date field to make items searchable in the timeline search function. The enrichment only uses the first date in a date range and will only use the first date in a group of dates in the resource metadata. Unlike the geographic field, the date is not connected to other resources through a text link, but rather through the timeline function on the right side of the resource view. And right above that, we have the actual, what it looks like in the timeline function. So another thing to take into consideration when you are making your items, or your metadata rather, available to DPLA. DPLA uses social media and digital exhibitions to highlight resources contributed by hubs such as the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub, which improves visibility of resources and the institutions that own them. However, DPLA will only highlight materials that are free of watermarks, banding, and branding, and are completely open to the public. In addition, please make sure that all metadata has associated digital content. When metadata has no digital content, it results in the resource having no thumbnail or preview image, which is not super for the user who is coming to your item through DPLA. They don't know what they're getting into. And then digital materials are the most usable and accessible when they are free of restrictions and when all metadata is accompanied by a digital object. And if you are interested in seeing DPLA's full social media policy, that is in the IDHH Metadata Best Practices document and is linked there. So, again, kind of going back to what I just mentioned, DPLA would like resources that are accessible to all, meaning that the resources have no IP restrictions, copyright restrictions with limited viewing, or records that only have metadata with no digital object attached. If any records in your collection fall into these categories, please use the value not DPLA in the DC relation field, so that the IDHH will be able to remove the record from the DPLA ingestion. This field can be made so that it is not visible in your local digital, or so that it is not visible in your local digital collection, but it should be harvestable by DPLA. So meaning that it will not affect how the record is made available in the native environment, just how it will be harvested or not by DPLA. So at this point, I think we're going to try to take some questions, and if nobody has any questions, we can move on to the second part, but I'll open the floor for questions at this point.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. So anybody on the webinar, I would encourage you, using the questions pane on the control panel, you can send any questions in, and I will read them so you can all hear what questions your colleagues are sending in. So not sure if this is one that you can address, Hannah, but one question that was sent in is as follows. Our content DM software has city, state, country as separate fields, and they're wondering if you know how they can combine into one line.
That I don't know. I don't know if there's an automated process because I don't work with Content DM directly.
Right.
But I can look into it, and I would be happy to follow up with that.
Okay. And let's see. One person's having trouble accessing your resource list. So Pamela and others, I will just email that resource list to everybody in case you're having trouble downloading it from GoToWebinar, which occasionally does happen. Okay, yes, Hannah, I guess if you do find any kind of a response to that question, I can certainly follow up then with that response. Okay. I will say for Alyssa that another user has chimed in that they're also a Content DM user, and we upload compound objects that have a date range rather than a single date. So they're wondering if that complicates the date field in DPLA.
When it goes into DPLA, it will actually just pull the first date that's in that date range. So depending on how you want that date related to the item, you might want to change your metadata if that first date is inappropriate. But generally speaking, those date ranges are going to be close enough to the item that somebody will be able to find the resource. So yeah, that's my answer to that.
Okay. Another question that came in, what scheme do you recommend for geographic location in order to take advantage of DPLA's geographic enrichment?
So because they're using geonames specifically, that's a really great place to start. I believe that geonames relies on URIs, which most of our contributors are using content DM, so that URI isn't going to be super helpful in that instance, but you can at least see what the what that specific term is going to match to. So when I'm looking over our contributors metadata, I will often look and see if I will look in geonames to see if the geographic term that they're using is going to match correctly. And that really depends on the ambiguity or lack of ambiguity for the name. So that's a good place to use geographic names. And I have, I think, one or two other controlled vocabularies that's in the IDHH Metadata Best Practices in the geographic field. So I would say take a look at that because I'm not remembering the other two, but geonames for sure.
Okay. All right. At this point, it looks like that's all the questions, but I know there will be one other opportunity at the end for everyone to ask some final questions before we wrap up. So Hannah, if you just want to continue on, and we'll do some more questions later.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right, so part 2, we're going to talk about the Illinois Digital Heritage Hub best practices in particular and how those relate to DPLA. Again, these are all based off of the DPLA metadata application profile and the information that we are giving to DPLA from our contributors. So how and why were these developed? Metadata guidelines are needed to ensure that the metadata is interoperable amongst multiple platforms. This allows for the metadata to be located in the most appropriate field. It guarantees that it will be represented well and ultimately enables your resources to be discoverable, which is the ultimate goal of these best practices. This is especially important when the metadata is made available in a service provider's environment, and that includes DPLA or in other states they have state service hubs that are not related to DPLA, so that was another instance where that would be helpful. These guidelines were put together specifically to make the rich and unique digital resources contributed to the IDHH to be represented in DPLA in the most effective and discoverable way. And the metadata fields included in this presentation are used by the IDHH and are presented in order of requirement. And for a full description of each field, I would suggest looking at that IDHH Best Practices document. I will be going over these fairly in depth, but there will be more information in the Best Practices document. So each of the metadata fields in the IDHH Metadata Best Practices includes a definition that describes the scope of use. Following that, each field includes notes that give information on how best to use that field. Some, though not all, include a list of controlled vocabularies where that is appropriate. These are intended to encourage the use of consistent terms. And then every metadata field includes examples and use cases that highlight the best way to use the field. Lastly, it should be noted that metadata that is contributed to DPLA, even if it is not visible in the user interface, is still searchable. I will say that multiple times during this because it's really important to consider that. So why controlled vocabularies matter? They provide consistency of terms that are used in a collection, as well as being able to provide consistency beyond the local digital collection. Additionally, in both DPLA and many content management systems, terms are linked, which facilitates better search and discovery. And when terms match, they link, but when they don't match, due to either inconsistent practices, spelling, or grammatical errors, they won't link. So it's really important to consider that. And in the DPLA environment, controlled vocabularies help with the enrichments, which we talked about just a moment ago. So what is mapping and why does it matter? In DPLA, shareable metadata can be achieved by careful mapping, and mapping is the process of determining which elements from one schema correspond to the elements of another schema, and mapping enables interoperability between metadata schema. IDHH harvests metadata in qualified Dublin core that is mapped from contributing institutions' local metadata fields. The harvested metadata is then mapped to the DPLA metadata application profile, and this makes it possible for metadata from a data provider to be viewable in a service provider's environment. The next slide will show that crosswalk again, just to kind of touch on that again. So I wanted to bring it back as it shows the crosswalk from MOD's simplified Dublin core and qualified Dublin core to the DPLA map. The column on the left, again, includes the corresponding DPLA label, with the labels in bold being the ones that are viewed in the DPLA user interface or the portal. And again, even if fields are not visible in DPLA, in the DPLA portal, they're still fully text searchable. So this begins where we're actually talking about the elements themselves. So the title field is required but not repeatable. The title of the resource should be descriptive yet succinct. Titles with identifiers, file names, or archival organization units are not useful to search and discovery, especially in the DPLA environment, and they should be avoided if possible. There are many different ways of creating or assigning titles to digital resources, and it can be more useful to err on the side of too descriptive over too vague. For instance, in this example, the title of the text is Frankenstein. So you see that here. If it is necessary to include a secondary title, it is recommended to use alternate title. This field can include a fuller form of the title that may appear elsewhere on the resource when title is taken directly from the title page of the resource, and when it's not a full title. Or it can also include the subtitle of the resource. So again, using Frankenstein as an example, the alternate title might be Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus as a fuller version of the title, or simply the alternate title could be the Modern Prometheus. The alternate title field is not required and it is repeatable. And the title field is visible in the DPLA, but the alternate title will not be visible. One of the reasons why we suggest that the title field not be repeated is because when that goes into DPLA, it becomes very confusing for that mapping to figure out which of your titles is the actual title. So it's something to consider when you are making that available to DPLA. So rights, this is kind of a hot topic right now in digital collections. And it is definitely an area that interests me personally. But at any rate, we'll keep on going with that. The rights field is both required and repeatable. It is used to describe the rights held in and over the resource. This usually includes the condition of use or the copyright statement for the resource. It is important to note that the copyright holder is not necessarily the institution that provides access to the resource, and an institution may be the copyright owner if the original copyright owner assigned the rights to the institution in a written statement, or if the institution was the creator of the original resource. And simply owning an object does not make you the rights holder necessarily. Similarly, according to the Bridgman decision, the digitization is not a significant enough transformation to apply a new copyright to the resource. So those are a handful of things that you want to think about as well. Contributors to the IDHH are encouraged to consider using the standardized right statements made available at rightstatements.org. And this allows for users to know how they can interact with the resource in a clear and unambiguous way. So this can be done by including a rights field with the URI of the standardized rights statement. These statements can be used in addition to the current free text rights statements that are included with each resource. The standardized rights statement should not conflict with the free text rights statement. So that is another thing to bear in mind if you decide to use standardized rights statements. And it is recommended that we as IDHH recommends that donor and funding information is not made available in this field, as it's not really the rights itself. And if, again, it kind of goes back to that context situation. If you just have a name in the rights field, it is very unclear if the name relates to the copyright holder or if it's just a donor, and providing context really helps a lot in that situation. So in this example here, this is coming from the New York Public Library, we see that there is both free text, both a free text rights statement as well as the standardized rights statement. So you have the standardized rights statement there, the free text rights statement, and then underneath the thumbnail we see the type of copyright that the resource has, and that is getting pulled from the URI in the standardized rights statement field. Regardless of whether you and your institution are interested in the standardized rights statements, I highly recommend watching Emily Gore and Greg Cram's presentation on copyright and using standardized rights statements. That is available as a DPLA workshop. It's a video that's available on YouTube, so it's free and open to the public, and I think that Greg Cram does a really excellent job of laying out what is appropriate in the copyright field or in the rights field and how it relates to copyright. So I would highly recommend watching that. So data provider. The data provider field is both required and repeatable. This field is used for the name of the contributing institution that has created the digital collection to which the resource belongs. The name of the contributing institution will be seen on the link that DPLA provides under the image thumbnail in the user interface, such as the top example. If this field is not used, DPLA will default to get full image from contributing institution instead of including the institution name, such as in the bottom example. So you see there, get full image from contributing institution. And then we have the actual name of the institution there. So the identifier field is required and is not repeatable. It is visible in the DPLA user interface. Sorry, it is not visible in the DPLA user interface. Local identifiers should not be used in this field as it does not aid in search and discovery. And the value for the identifier should be a web accessible URI that distinctly identifies the resource. So you see here what we, this is what I see when I'm looking at the OAI PMH feed in XML. You have the identifier there. And if you do have file names or other information that you map to the identifier field, I would recommend either not mapping that to Dublin Core so that we don't harvest that, or similarly you can map that to a different field that might be more appropriate. And I can look into that and recommend some options, but those options will vary by institution and the metadata that's being described as well. So we kind of touched on the date and temporal coverage before. The date field is strongly recommended and is not repeatable. When more than one date field is used in the local environment, such as the original date, a digitization date, or an acquisition date, only the original date should be mapped to date. And this is necessary for the best representation in the DPLA environment because users are able to limit their searches by date. And false creation dates, such as digitization dates, appearing as creation dates, are not useful. If a date range is used, as I mentioned earlier, DPLA will use the first date in the date range for the timeline search function. And the date field is visible in the user interface. Then temporal coverage is recommended if available and repeatable, and it is repeatable. It is used to describe temporal characteristics of the resource and not the creation date. In this example, we see a date range of 1890 to 1900 in that lower example, and other examples might include eras, centuries, or decades. Decades is one example that I see a lot in our collections. The temporal coverage field will not be visible in the DPLA user interface, but again, completely text searchable. So here we go. Here are the controlled vocabulary names for place. So the place field is recommended if available, and it is repeatable. However, even though the field is repeatable, formatting matters, again, what we mentioned earlier, for how this information is displayed in DPLA. So it's recommended that terms not be separated into individual fields because the DPLA enrichment will treat them as individual locations and not as a combined location. And again, going back to the example of Cairo, Illinois, it will have a bad match to Cairo, Egypt if Cairo is not specified, if there's no context given to it in that single field. And for more information on that, the DPLA Geographic and Temporal Guidelines is linked in the IDHH Metadata Best Practices. I found that personally very useful. I would highly recommend taking some time with it. And because place is used in the Explore by Map function in the DPLA portal, it's recommended if it is available. Not all materials will have an associated place, but materials become more discoverable if they include place information. And that is especially important when a user is limiting their search by a given place. If you don't have the information there, it will actually remove the item from that user's search. So type and language. The type field is strongly recommended and is repeatable. Type describes the nature or the genre of the resource, and limiting search results by type is useful to users, and anything that does not include a type field will not be part of the search results that are limited by type, just like geographic information. Including the type field will make resources more discoverable. So in this example here, we see that there are 1,421 images in this particular search. There's 425 text results, and if you don't have image as your type, it will not show up in those results. So that's something to be aware of. The language field is also strongly recommended for text materials, and it is repeatable. This field should only be used if there is text in the resource, and it's not intended to describe the metadata. Some examples of where using the language field would be useful are letters, documents, books, interviews, any aspect of audio that is language based in nature. So those are all areas that you want to consider if you would want to consider using the language field if you have language as part of that item. So subject. The subject field is strongly recommended and it is repeatable. This field will be visible in the user interface and will link to other resources with the same terms. This field is used to describe the topic of the resource, while a compound term, as in the first image, can provide granularity to a topic. It is less useful for search and discovery in DPLA. So DPLA recommends that terms be in separate fields, such as in the second example, where each term is in a separate wrapper. They are not concatenated, and that just makes the item more discoverable in that environment. So creator and contributor. The creator field is recommended to be included if available, and it is repeatable. It's visible in the DPLA user interface. The creator field describes an entity primarily responsible for making the resource, and that includes but is not limited to authors, photographers, or painters. For both the creator and contributor field, it is recommended that corporate names are in direct order, such as in the first example here, where the creator name is Thompson Brothers, so that's in direct order, and then personal names should be formatted as last name, first name, and then life dates, and that's, for example, in the second example. The contributor field is optional and it is repeatable, but it's not visible in the DPLA user interface. The field is used for any entity responsible for making contributions to the resource. This may be a personal name or a corporate name, and again, they should follow those order naming conventions as described previously. So medium is both optional and repeatable, and this field is used to describe the physical medium of the resource. The above example uses the thesaurus of graphic materials as a controlled vocabulary. And the extent field is both recommended and repeatable. This field is used to describe the duration of a resource, such as the length of a video or audio recording, or the size of a 2- or 3-dimensional object. The extent descriptions as provided by the New York Public Library digital collections here describe the physical size of 2 different objects. One is in centimeters and the other is in centimeters and inches. And neither of these fields are visible in the DPLA user interface, so that is something to consider as well. The collection field is required and is not repeatable. It is used for the name of the collection or aggregation that the resource is a part. This example includes the name of the digital collection, though this field can be used to describe the physical collection of which that resource is a part. So here we see the digital collection. Relation is optional and repeatable. This field is used to connect other resources with the resource being described. If the relationship that is being described is that of the digital collection to which the resource belongs, that information should really be added in the collection field instead of the relation field, as previously mentioned. This field may be used to describe a related archival collection or when the item is a part of a series. In this example, the resource being described is related to the physical collection MSS 80, Robert W. Limbert Collection at Boise State University, and neither of these fields is visible in the DPLA user interface. And that pretty much wraps up the elements themselves, but again, like I said, it is, I would highly recommend looking at the IDHH Metadata Best Practices document, as it does go into depth on some of these items about specifics. And I will also make these slides, I will hopefully Rails will be able to make these slides available as a PDF, so if you want to go back to these specific examples, you have that as well. And at this point, I think we are able to take some more questions.
Great. Thank you, Hannah. We'll let you catch your breath here for a moment. So to your point, yes, we will make these slides available as a PDF, and they'll be you'll be able to access them from our Continuing Education Archives page along with the recording of this session and the resource list. So that'll all be there in one place. And again, if you attended today's webinar and registered for it, you'll get an email from us when it's available, which will probably be by the end of the day Friday at the latest, I would say. So at this point, just as we did halfway through, if there are any other questions that folks have, use the question pane again, and we'll try to get through a few before it reaches 2 o'clock. One question, Hannah, so the workshop that we'll hopefully be offering in the fall, can you just say a few words on what anyone who would be attending the workshop would be doing? Would it just be delving deeper into the things you covered today? Can you say anything about that workshop?
Sure, yeah. So part of what that workshop will entail is a little bit more hands-on as far as kind of examples of how mapping is going to matter and where things will show up in DPLA. So it'll just be yeah, that'll be one aspect to it. We'll also cover the importance of and so that's one other aspect.
Okay.
And I think there might be one or two other things in there, but those are the two main points that I want to dig into in that.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So again, if you register for today's webinar, we will send you an announcement once the date and time, location have all been determined for that workshop. And if it's possible, we will also try to live stream that workshop. But we really do hope that that some people will be able to attend the workshop in person to take advantage of the opportunity to really do some hands-on activities around this topic. So with that, I am not seeing any other questions roll in, so I'll give you guys about 10 more seconds if there are any questions. And if there are not, Hannah, I thank you for your time and for this information today. And thank you all for attending the webinar and for your participation. And with that, have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thanks, Hannah. Bye now.
Bye.